Welcome back, everybody, to the Informed Homebuyer Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Rich Curtis, and I have my co-host with me, Dave Miller. Morning, Dave.
Hey, Rich, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
All right, today we're talking all about appraisals, and you might be thinking, who cares? Or this is a really dry subject, and you've already clicked off. But you really want to stick this one out because the landscape is shifting under our feet in the market right now, and we could see some upcoming appraisal issues that we literally have not seen in years, which means you potentially, as a buyer or a home seller who's going to turn around and be a buyer, are just not prepared to deal with these particular issues. And you need to have a real estate team that's been around long enough and been in markets long enough that does know these issues and does know how to deal with them. So we're going to go through what an appraisal is, why you need one, when you need one, when you don't need one, and what are the most common problems that arise with appraisals, and how do we deal with them and fix those problems? Because some of these problems that we're going to discuss, we may start seeing here by the end of 2025. As you might have known, if you've watched every one of our podcasts, which I certainly hope you have, we expect potentially to see some declines in the market. It's very variable right now. There's a lot of uncertainty that could not come to fruition, but as of now, the signs are pointing towards price declines by the end of the year, this year in 2025. And when we have a market that depreciates and has price declines, there are certain appraisal issues that pop up. Like I said, ones we haven't seen for a while. So we're going to get stuck right into it. Dave, what is an appraisal?
Well, Rich, appraisal is a independent third-party licensed appraiser that determines the value of a home. And you could have appraisers for anything, right? Like there's different appraisals, but a real estate appraiser is someone that will go out, they will validate the home in terms of quality, measurements, kind of age of use, and there's all kinds of formulas that they have on their actual appraisal report in terms of age of life, deterioration of the property, normal wear and tear. And so a typical appraisal or a full appraisal will go out there, they'll measure the home, the square footage, validate the square footage. And we've seen it a lot where, you sell a house and you list it on MLS, and the square footage is 2,500 feet. The appraiser gets out there and says, well, it's only 2,000 feet. So there's all kinds of where someone did an addition that wasn't permitted. Can we use that? Can we not use it? Is it included in the value? So I don't want to get too deep in that, but the appraiser is going to go out there and validate all of these things, finishes and appliances, all of that good stuff, and then come to what they consider is a value of the property, fair market value based on comparables in the same general proximity of that home. So on acreage, they go out further and track homes. They're just within a short distance or relatively short distance, and they try to find either model matches or similar homes, similar square footage, similar neighborhoods, and say this home is going to justify the value of this house that I'm appraising based on what it sold for within usually the past 90 days, sometimes a little bit further out. So that's, a little bit of a rambling answer on what the appraisal is.
When you say a neutral third party evaluator, that's the key here. You have one estimation of value, which is what the seller thinks it's worth and their realtor decided worth, and that's the listing price. You have another estimation of value, which is what the buyer thinks it's worth and their realtor thinks it's worth and what they put on an offer. And then you have the market value, which is what those two agree to. So there's a difference between appraised value and market value. Market value, the simple definition of the market value of your home is what a willing seller is willing to accept and a willing buyer is willing to pay. So the listing price is one estimation of value. The buyer's offer is another estimation of value. Market value is what they actually agree to buy the home. And then an appraised value is a neutral third party. They're neutral in the sense that they're not selling the home, so they don't have a dog in the fight of how much they get for it. They're not buying the home, so they don't have a dog in a fight of getting a deal for it. They don't work for the realtors. They don't work for the lenders. In fact, there's strict rules. Dave has to order these things through like central appraisal management companies, can't even reach out or contact them or sway the value at all. And this person establishes an appraised value for the purposes. Well, there's two purposes. I'll give one and I'll let Dave give the lending one. One purpose is it protects the buyers from, realtors maybe having, because we have a dog in a fight, maybe swaying our opinion of value. This gives them a neutral third-party opinion of value. Is it close to what we said or is it wildly off? It can be off again because they're basing it on comps and you and the seller are just basing it on feelings, what you both are willing to pay and accept. So there is a delta there, but is the delta really broad? So one mechanism is to protect you and make sure you have another opinion of value, not just the realtors. And then who else does the appraisal protect, Dave?
It protects the lender, Rich, and in confirming the, it's the appraiser is the eyes and ears for the lender, the ultimate lender, which typically is going to be, the Fannie Mae or VA or Freddie Mac or FHA, because they just don't have the resources to go out and look at every property. You need an appraiser to validate and determine the value of the property, which will have an impact on your loan. I would say, and we'll get into this, the bulk of the time, more often than not, the value comes in at whatever the price is, because usually the realtors have done a good job and they've based the property based on the market, what the market sees. Now there's laggards there and lagging time. I don't want to jump too far ahead. But as I mentioned, they're typically going to go back, 90 days, sometimes a little bit longer. And it becomes even really problematic when there isn't any recent sales. Then they have to either go back farther or try to use properties that aren't as similar. And I know, Rich, up in, where in the foothills and where there's larger properties or horse properties or acreage, there's a lot of things that could sway the value of the property versus a cookie cutter home in Folsom that's in a tract home that there's, 5 other model matches within a quarter mile radius.
I know it's a double-edged sword. I always say, God, it would be so much easier if I only sold in Folsom. I do sell in Folsom, and it's great because I can comp a house super quick in Folsom. But at the same token, I love all the custom homes up here. But where I might have 45 minutes or an hour into comping a house in Folsom, I can have 3 to 5 hours into comping a house up here. We have houses with $300,000 tree houses with HVAC and zip lines. I sold a house with a pond with a waterfall, right? How many comps are you going to have for a house with a pond and a waterfall going right by the shower to the master bedroom? I mean, there's just incredible stuff up here. And it does get hard to comp, but ultimately that appraisal is to protect the bank's interest in the unlikely event, God forbid, you can't make your mortgage payments. They have to take that house back in foreclosure. They want security that they can sell it for at least what they're owed on it, so they can make themselves whole on the property. And the appraisal is the appraiser is there to provide an appraisal to give them that assurance, so that they are willing to make the loan. So I always tell my sellers, I got to sell your house twice. I got to sell it to the buyer first, and then I got to sell it to the bank. And depending on the market conditions, one of the two of those sales is harder, right? So if we're in a strong buyer's market, the sale to the buyer is harder. But if we're in a rapidly appreciating or rapidly depreciating market, the sale to the bank is harder. And that's where we see appraisal issues pop up. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is what some of those issues are, why we think some of them, might pop up down the road. But in general, an appraisal is required almost any time you're getting a loan on the property. If you're a cash buyer, you don't have to do an appraisal. In fact, most of my cash buyers choose not to spend that money and go through those machinations to do that. They end up just going with the market value. But if you've got a loan, you're going to have to get an appraisal no matter what, except for sort of one niche case, which Dave has been pretty successful at this over the last few years. But let's talk about that, Dave. When do we maybe not have to get an appraisal for the bank?
Well, typically in a rapidly appreciating market, a lot of history, and typically these are with like a Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac loan, where we get what's called a PIW, a property inspection waiver, or an appraisal waiver. And typically we see those when folks have really good credit. You're putting a reasonable amount down, typically more than 20% down. The more you put down, the higher likelihood that you're going to get that appraisal waiver. And it's just an algorithm that the lenders have, and oftentimes that lender may have owned that home for the person that's selling the home. So it's possible they own an appraisal that was done on that house 2 years prior or 6 months prior or whenever, or the 4 other houses on the same block had a recent appraisal done in their same square footage, so they're willing to just accept that value as the value of the home. The one thing I will also important to point out is when you are purchasing a home and you are getting a loan and you're required to have an appraisal, the lenders are always going to provide your loan to value based on the lesser of the two, the purchase price or the appraisal. So if you buy a home for 600,000. It appraises at 650. No, that doesn't mean you get to borrow that extra 50,000. You're capped at the 600,000. So, and
Right.
now if the appraiser were to come in below and at 590, you can't borrow up to 600 based on the purchase price. The lesser of the value is the appraised. The lesser of the two is the appraisal. So important
Yeah.
to note there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're going to jump into some of the problems. It's great if we can get an appraisal waiver, but most often we have to get an appraisal when we have a loan involved. And there are multiple issues. So, and we're going to go through all of these. We're going to go through timeline issues. We're going to go through, call outs for repairs. And we're going to go into what happens when things come under value, which is one I think we could see upcoming this year. But starting with timeline issues, depending on what's going on in the market, how many loans are being initiated, how many appraisals are happening, appraisal can be one of the stickier timelines in the transaction. You've usually got about 17 to 21 days, depending on how the contract's written, to get your appraisal in. But if the market is more of a seller's market, you might have to be compromising on that. If there's multiple offers, you might be knocking that down to 14 or 12 days, which gets really tight. So our first issue is always, can we get an appraiser out there in time, or whether that's going to blow our timelines? Most often we can, but we do face that one sometimes. And Dave, you've got some insight. You can kind of gauge by what's been happening in the market to inform the realtors you work with as to how long right now in this environment it'll take, correct?
Yeah, and based on the volume of transactions that are taking place, based on our history, as an organization ordering a lot of appraisals, we also work through, not every lender works through the same appraisal management companies. So we really keep our finger on the pulse in terms of how long is it taking to get an appraisal done, and sometimes a little bit longer timelines if it's a harder property to comp for that appraiser. So we talked about,
Yeah.
maybe Folsom, California, where you have a lot of similar track homes. That appraiser is it's a fair amount, or less work for that appraiser to comp that. And then it is, like Rich talked about, some of the, elaborate homes in the foothills that are unique and there's not as many comparables that they have to drive around, take pictures of. So that comes into play. But we typically know in either issue a relatively within a few days of how quickly we can get that appraisal back. And Rich, I've been working with you a long time, and one of the things we do as as an advocate for our consumers is, you go into contract to buy a home, you typically want to get a home inspection or other inspections. We try to time it where the home inspection or any other inspection, especially if you're not 100% certain, are done first before the appraisal. The appraisal could be anywhere between $500 and $800. So if the home inspection's done and you're on site with the home inspector and the home inspector finds, 5 or 6 things that says run from this house, you don't want to spend the money on the appraisal.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
especially if you're in a situation where the home inspector's out there and there's a lot of stuff, but you're not afraid of it, but you want the seller to take care of it, and you just know the seller's not going to do it. So those are things we consider whether we get that appraisal or not. And then we can also, I know, Rich, you've asked me several times, hey, can we get a rush on that appraisal? Let's wait till the home inspection, and then we'll rush the appraisal. Well, I've been doing this long time. I can order the appraisal and ask for the inspection date to be a day after the home inspection's done, because typically we don't have to wait for the home inspection report to be sent back from the home inspector. Rich, you typically go to the home inspections whether the buyer's there or not, and you'll know if they call out something major. You'll pick up the phone and call me, hey Dave, that appraisal is supposed to be tomorrow. Let's hold that off a day or two until I see if these sellers are going to work with me. Maybe it's a shot HVAC system or something that's going to be a relatively high cost, and you just want the confidence level that the seller's going to work with you on that. So in those cases, we will push out the appraisal by a couple days, just to give you
Yeah,
that flex.
that's a really important point, and it's one of the things we do to take care of you and try to limit losses or financial exposure. What's great in California, again, we are almost always talking from a California perspective. I can sell anywhere in the state of California, but I mostly do the 5 counties here: El Dorado, Placer, Nevada, Amador, and Sacramento. Dave can write loans in the whole state of California, whole state of Nevada. But we're talking from a California perspective, and California does a great job of protecting the buyers, in that if you put down your earnest money deposit, which is often 3% of the purchase price, so making the math easy, you're buying a $500,000 house, you're going to put up a $15,000 earnest money deposit. Let's protect it all the way through the inspection period. You can bail out for any reason and get that money back. You do have some financial exposure on the cost of your inspection, so that's where you can lose money. So whatever you spend to inspect the house, and your appraisal is an inspection, typically buyer paid inspection, that falls under that category. Now, to do a home right, I believe, and inspect it fully, you're going to spend between $1,600 and $2,000. Well, the appraisal being $500 to $800 of that, that is something we can save you if we find some deal breakers. It's actually exceptionally rare that we do find deal breakers on inspections. I can think of 2 or 3 cases over the years where someone's actually really bailed out on inspections. And it's been wild stuff, like a foundation that's cracked and heaved this far in the middle of a room, or we found a 3,000 gallon spring fed cistern under a house that it just bubbled up water into the basement nonstop, and there was no way to ever stop it. And so the basement was all funky and moldy, and there's just no way, nothing you could do about that. Okay, buyer bailed out on that. But the vast majority of inspections don't have deal breakers or sleeping dragons built into them. But in case they do, if we slow roll that appraisal order for enough time to get the results of your home inspection, if there was a deal breaker for you, then yeah, you spent your $500 on the home inspection, but you didn't spend $500 on the home inspection and $500 on your appraisal. So we just saved you $500. So working with a team that's looking out for you and can pace this out and time it appropriately for you can save you lots of money, because of course, if you move on to another house, you have to spend that money again. So we can at least save you that piece of it. So that's a really important point Dave was making.
Yeah, and I think the other point of that is timeline on that appraisal. The standard contract, I think, 17 days to get an appraisal done and report, you know, from the on the contractual purposes to be able to remove your appraisal contingency, which means as a lender, if you were on 17 days, I would need that report back much sooner or several days before that, depending on, whether it's a weekend or not, and let an underwriter also sign off on that appraisal ahead of those 17 days.
Yeah.
But in a competitive market, Rich, you have shortened timelines, or, what does that look like on an appraisal from a, contractual purposes to maybe sweeten the deal when you're submitting an offer?
Yeah, anytime there's multiple offers, or if we're in a crazy seller's market like we were end of 2020, all of 2021, first half of 22, you're offering to do appraisal in 7 to 12 days tops. And actually, a lot of people were waiving their appraisals back there and doing appraisal waivers. In addition to now, that's not the kind of appraisal waiver Dave was saying. They still had to get an appraisal. They had to pay for an appraisal. What they were saying is, I am taking away my ability to bail out of the transaction if the appraisal doesn't come in at value, which is one of the appraisal problems we're going to address in a moment. And people were even agreeing to pay that appraisal gap themselves if they were not a VA. VA, you cannot, right? VA and FHA, correct. Or just VA? It's just VA.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if they were not a VA loan, they were agreeing to pay the appraisal gap themselves. That was a lot of the kind of shenanigans that were going on in 21. I think people assume realtors love that kind of market because it's flying, it's hot. I hate that kind of market because all the usual guardrails and safeguards built in for our buyers start getting stripped away by buyers' decisions. I want this house. So everybody else is removing the appraisal contingency. I'm going to do it. Everybody else is saying I'll pay up to 50 grand above appraised value. I'm going to do it. And so there's a lot of that going on in that kind of, chaotic market. So the usual is 17. If we know things are backed up or we have some other issues going on, or the house is more of a fixer upper where we anticipate we need to do more inspections before we want to pay for that, we might ask for a little longer, 21. But usually it's 14 to 17 days is what we're getting, unless we're in a chaotic market like that COVID market. So that's timeline. Timeline usually isn't an issue. Dave and I have been doing this long enough. We can work out that timeline issue for you. It's something that happens in the background. We tell you the pros and cons, and then we move on. That usually isn't our biggest issue. The big issues we're going to hit on appraisals are going to be appraisals coming in light and call outs. Appraisals coming in light, meaning undervalue, is something we have not seen in quite some time. Technically we were actually seeing it in the during that crazy pandemic market, just nobody cared. People were just waiving it and agreeing to make the difference. So we did see for those 3 years a lot of appraisals come in light because it was a rapidly appreciating market, meaning this guy is getting 40 grand more than the last guy got for the same house on the same street. But the appraisers only have what the last guy got to base their data on. They are not going with market value and the bidding value that was in the market. And so they couldn't keep up. And so we had a lot coming in light. Those weren't as big of a problem because people were willing to make up the difference. The reverse is true in a depreciating market where we start coming in light because successive home sales are coming in less than the other ones. And people aren't willing to make up the difference when the property's falling because they're assuming that it could continue to fall and they may be upside down on value after making a purchase. I want to be clear that we are not in that position today. But our read of the tea leaves at the moment, the way they're pointing, is that we likely will see depreciating market value by the end of this year. That could not come to fruition. We did just get some positive CPI data, which is making it look like we may not slip into as bad of a situation as we think. But there's still a lot to wash out as the recording of this video in terms of financial uncertainty. So we could see some losses. So we're going to address that now. So Dave, when we get an appraisal and it comes in light to you as the lender, I'll talk about what our options are as a buyer. But what does that do in terms of loan value and what the lender's willing to give and not give?
Yeah, and so when you get a mortgage loan, typically your pricing in the loan program is based on loan to value. So I'll use round numbers. You're buying a $600,000 house, and you're going to put 20% down, 120,000, and you submit that offer for 600,000. So you're going to have a $480,000 mortgage. The appraisal comes in at 590. Well, we use the lesser of the two. So your loan, the loan that you were gonna do is now not, it's over 80% because the value isn't there. Less than 20% of equities down. So you have options as the buyer. You can certainly borrow the delta, especially if you're in a position to put 20% down, or you come in with more money and make up the difference so you still have the 20% down. That's if the seller wants to stick to the $600,000 sales price. But also to that point is that doesn't necessarily mean what that house is worth to you. That house might still be worth 600,000 to you. It is just that the appraiser, based on the recent comps, was not able to provide higher value on a market perspective for that particular home. And sometimes homes have upgrades and things that the appraiser can't add, 100% value to. Sometimes with a pool, you could put in $100,000 pool and maybe they're only giving it $20,000 worth of value. So doesn't mean the value isn't there, but you just are restricted from the loan perspective. And so you do have those options. And, where it really comes in tight is when you're only putting a very little amount money down and the appraisal comes in light. That's where we run into problems.
Yeah, right. If you have enough money down and you have enough extra room in your qualification and you're in a loan program like a conventional loan
Mhm.
where you're putting 20% down, but it can go all the way to like 95, even right now, 97% loan to
Yeah.
value, then all this is going to do is maybe shift your payment around, not
Yes.
not be a
Yep.
deal breaker for you because you can
Right.
utilize your ability to borrow more to make up that gap. If you as the buyer chose to accept that payment gap, which is one of your three options. But like to your point, where it becomes a problem is if you're an FHA loan or a conventional loan and you're only putting 3% down. So
Right.
you're
Yes.
already at max loan to value. Then
Right.
the only solution then would be to make up the difference out of pocket and cash somehow. Or I'll talk about the other solutions from the seller side. But you
Yep.
cannot borrow more to solve that problem, correct?
Right. That is correct.
So whenever we get these low appraisals in, you've really got three options. You can just bail out of the deal and be like, house isn't worth what I thought it was worth. I don't want it. I'm going to go get another one. You can see if you within your loan qualification, like we just, so I guess four options. See if within your loan qualification you can just eat that amount by borrowing more. You can make up the difference in cash, or the fourth option, and the most common in a depreciating market. So those other two options of borrow more or make it up in cash is what people do in a appreciating market where there's multiple offers and people are kind of falling all over themselves to give things to the sellers just to get a house. So that was what was happening all during COVID. But if we do see price depreciation and declines, most often what happens in declining market is a buyer will come back to the seller with that appraisal report and say, Mr. Seller, I want you to reduce the purchase price down to appraised value. And then we negotiate that out. In very rare instances, the realtors can provide additional comps and kind of fight the value and ask for an appraisal review with the appraiser. But I've not seen that. And I don't know what your experience is today, but I've not seen that to be successful very often.
Yeah, unless there was definitely a comp or maybe a new comp hit the market after they did the report, or
Yeah.
they just missed a comp and you do what's called an appraisal review or appraisal rebuttal, and you provide them with some additional information and they can say, okay, yes, I maybe missed this. I'm willing to increase the value. It does happen. I've seen it happen, but probably less often than it actually does happen.
Gotcha. So
Yeah.
if we do see declines in the market, if we do see prices come down and we get an appraisal that comes in, undervalued, 20, 30 grand undervalue, you can choose to borrow your way out of it by increasing what you're borrowing. If you have that free board there, you can choose to pull that money out of savings and pay it in cash. Or you can choose to walk away, or you can choose to ask the seller to reduce down to the purchase price. Those are your four options, and it's not always a deal breaker. This is where negotiating comes into play. As your buyer's agent, your realtor, myself, hopefully in this market, or whoever your trusted professional is in your market, are going to go to the seller's agent and the sellers and make that claim and make that case as to why we should be reducing down to appraised value, particularly if the likelihood is that prices are going to continue to decline. And the timing of that ask is a very important piece. And so there's often in California, and this is different. It's different even in different markets in California. So I should say in
Yeah.
our market, in the Bay Area, they do this differently. In the Bay Area, they do all the inspections up front. You kind of have most of it baked in, and a request for repairs or price reduction or credit is more rare. In the 5 counties I work in, most often in the first 17 days, we do our inspections. And if there's some big things we didn't know about that popped up, we might ask for the seller to fix them. More often, we might ask for the seller to give us a credit to closing costs to cover the cost, or reduce the purchase price to cover that. And the timing of that ask comes into play. You never want your agent asking for a request for repairs before the appraisal is in. Because if I just got a $10,000 concession out of them for you because the HVAC system is shot, and then I come and say, I need another 30 grand out of you because the appraisal is low, I'm way less likely to get that second concession. We want to make that ask all together. So we do our inspection period, and our appraisal is part of that inspections. And we want that appraised value in before we make any requests from the seller, because there's all kinds of ways to play that where we might write off the HVAC system in favor of trying to get the $30,000 price concession for the appraisal. We might wrap it all together and ask for 40 grand, although that would likely be unsuccessful. But we need to be able to make the seller feel secure that we're not going to hit them a second time. And we need to make sure that we're not stepping over dollars to pick up pennies by asking them to fix a few things and burning our goodwill, and then coming in with a bigger price concession down the way.
Yeah, I think you brought a really good point on those price concessions, Rich. And I've seen it
Mm.
where, appraisal comes in light, $10,000, and you've already asked for a bunch of repairs. Or maybe you take some of those repairs off because you need and you can do those later after you move in. It's
Yeah.
not going to affect the ability to get the loan. And it's better off to build to the price reduction than the repairs, because your loan to value, I don't want to get too into the weeds here. But the other thing too that I think is important, that if you get an appraisal done and it comes in light and you go to the seller, it's not personal. You're not saying, I don't think your house is worth what I initially offered. And you're going to, your agent, Rich is the agent, you're going to present it to the listing agent and the seller based on, this is just what the appraiser comes at. And you have options. You could say no, right? You can agree to give the concession, all the concession, or maybe restart the negotiation and you go back and forth, depending on if that buyer even has the leeway to come in with the delta. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And typically when an offer's presented, a seller wants to see bank statements and know that the buyer has enough for cash for, their down payment and closing costs. And maybe if there's a little extra in there, if something comes in light, they're prepared to make up the difference.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be personal. It's just we got to negotiate because this is how the loan works. And as a seller, you're going to decide, well, I got a bird in the hand. I got a buyer. Am I going to lower my price by 5,000, or do I want to kick this guy out and go back on the market where I might be here for 3 months and not get another offer? So,
Yeah. And there's also certain loan programs where you're stuck with the appraisal, really only one, but talk about that. So if you're coming to a seller with most of our loan programs, that seller could go back to market with the gamble that they get a more friendly
right,
appraisal on the next loan. But there is one
right.
type of loan where they're stuck with it. So
Yeah, the
just talk briefly
FHA
about
loan
that.
is going to FHA loan. If I'm an FHA buyer and I write an offer on a house and I get an appraisal, that loan, that appraisal sticks with the house for a preset period of time. And so as a seller, I can sell it to a different type of loan borrower. I can go conventional and I'm not stuck with that appraisal. But if I'm going to sell it to another FHA buyer, that appraisal is going to stand true.
Yeah.
So, it just kind of depends on the market, and that's a risk you're willing to take. But if you decide you're not going to sell to an FHA buyer and you want to sell it for more, you are taking, sometimes based on the market, a good percentage of the buyer pool out of the equation.
Yeah, and that's part of the negotiation when we go back to the seller, say, look, this is an FHA loan.
Yeah.
You're stuck with this appraisal anyway. Let's work with this buyer who's willing to work with you and has already inspected the whole home and is accepting
Yeah.
everything else and is willing to get over the finish line here. And that is particularly a strong case when it's the type of home that is most likely to get another FHA buyer, right? So if you're in a
Yeah.
higher end home in the area, the likelihood of you drawing a lot of FHA loans is low. But if you're in a starter home, a below median home price, a first time buyer home, a 1,200 square foot home, you're most likely getting all or most FHA loans, and that's going to be a bigger issue for you. So you're better off dealing with the bird in the hand. And those are the kind of cases we make
Right.
when these things come up, you know?
Right.
Yeah. And so
Uh,
this, oh, what's that,
I
Dave?
was going to say, I think we were going to also talk about like not only the value, but the call outs an appraiser will make. They're, not only assessing the value, but they will just make sure health and safety issues are in place. There's things like, double strapped water heater. There's a CO2 and smoke detectors, and they're in the right places for different loans. They want to make sure that there's, a heat source. There's, the appliance or, exists. There's, things that they're going to check. And like an FHA appraisal, they're going to turn all these things on. They're going to turn on the stove. They're going to turn on the HVAC system, make sure it works. They're going to poke their head in the attic and see if anything jumps out. Versus a conventional appraisal, they're not going to do all that stuff. So
Yeah, and so there's different criteria for different appraisals. You are much more likely to get call outs on a VA or an FHA than on a conventional, and the sellers know this too, and that plays into their decision making. If they have options or multiple offers, they will take what kind of loan program you're getting into consideration. But that is our final appraisal issue that we're going to address, is those call outs. And when or if they happen, there's two things. One, we can get ahead of them. Dave and I have been doing this a long time. I've been in the business 20 years, Dave, 25 years.
yeah,
We can look at a house and know what's coming, and we can get ahead of that. We can even say to the seller, let's make some repairs. Let's get ahead of this so we don't have appraisal issues. And when I'm your listing agent, I'm going to tell you that up front. Hey, this is going to cause a problem. Let's just fix it before we come to market. That's the best way to deal with them. And then in the rears, we have a whole, cadre of contractors and handymen that we can use. So appraiser says, hey, we need you to fix this dry rot around this trim. We can give you someone, or give the seller someone who can get out there, do that work quickly. And then we do have to pay a little bit of a reinspect fee to get the appraiser to come out and sign off on that. But most often when we get call outs, it's just very rare for them to be terminal to the transaction. Most of the time we can get them fixed, get them reinspected, and it just might affect timelines. And so that is something that's not necessarily market forces specific. It's just property by property specific.
right. Yeah. And I think that's one of those deals where, it could really push timelines depending on the scope of work that needs to be done. So if appraiser
Yeah.
calls something out, and we previous podcast, we talked about, contingent, non-contingent buyers, simultaneous closes, all kinds of stuff. But
Yeah.
we're sometimes at the mercy of that appraiser coming out for that reinspection. It could be for the littlest thing. And I know, Rich, when you sell a home or you're working with buyers and you're going to tell the listing agent, hey, make sure, I walked through, I didn't see smoke detector or CO2 detector.
Yeah.
The buyer's going to have to pay for the reinspection, not the seller. So we want to make sure that stuff's there to begin with. And we want to make sure too that that's not going to slow it down for the seller. So we want to make sure those things are there.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are things we deal with those all the time. It's not that big of a deal most of the time. The big one, and we're not trying to scare anybody. We are not in this situation now, but coming down the road towards the end of 2025, we might begin to see these appraisals coming in light. If you're going to be a buyer in the market this year, which I assume you likely are if you're watching this content, then you want to be prepared for what's going to happen if an appraisal comes in light. You want to have that conversation with your lender and your realtor. Do you have the money to make up the gap, and are you willing? Do you have the freeboard in your loan qualification or your loan to value to make up that gap? Or are you 100% of the time going to go to the seller either by choice, because that's what you want to do, or by necessity because you're maxed out on all your levels? Are you going to have to go to the seller and ask for a price reduction? And if that is the case, that's something you guys need to take into consideration in your overall negotiating plan. And it's something for you to be informed about up front. So as usual, I appreciate you taking the time to get informed and to for your own financial education with us today. You've made it 34 minutes to the end of this podcast. So you're either a glutton for punishment or you really care about getting the best deal on your real estate transaction. Either way, we appreciate you being here with us today and making it to the end. My name is Rich Curtis.
And I'm Dave Miller. Thanks, Rich.
And we'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks for watching.